We are living in historic times. Yesterday, for the first time in the history of our country, a sitting president and the nominee, or presumptive nominee, of one of the two major parties dropped out just months away from the general election day. As we stand here today, we're 105 days away from Election Day in November. This has never happened in the history of our country. The closest analog is the 1968 election, when the incumbent president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, made the decision not to run for re-election, but LBJ did that many, many months earlier, and there was a full and vigorous Democrat primary to choose who the nominee was. In this instance, the Democrats have all voted. We've had primaries all across the country. They voted for Joe Biden, and they did so while their party was lying to them. Understand, Joe Biden's mental diminishment did not happen overnight. It did not happen yesterday. It did not happen the day of the debate. It has been evident for a long, long time that Joe Biden's mental capacities are severely diminished. It was evident in the year 2021. It was evident in the year 2022. It was evident in the year 2023, and it was evident this year, 2024. And yet, virtually every elected Democrat, and far too many in the corporate media, were actively complicit in the lie. It seems like it was 10 minutes ago that you had Democrats talking to any reporter who would listen, saying Joe Biden is the smartest, most capable, he's sharp, he's on it, he's in command of everything. That wasn't true. They knew it wasn't true. The reporters broadcasting it knew it wasn't true. But it was a deliberate lie to the voters. In the last 4 years, Joe Biden has had virtually zero meetings with any Republican senators. That is a strange thing. When the Senate is in session, the Republican senators all have lunch together. We regularly talk about how strange it is that none of us have spoken to Joe Biden. That is unusual. It is part of the job of serving in the Senate to deal with the president regularly. When Obama was president, I dealt with him regularly. When Trump was president, I spoke to him every week, sometimes every day. Almost none of us have even spoken to Joe Biden since he was sworn into office. That is deliberate. They quite literally hide him in the basement. Story broke recently about he hasn't had a cabinet meeting since October. His own cabinet members saying they virtually never speak to the man. By the way, that's not just this month. This is not a sudden illness that overcame him. This was true last year and the year before and the year before. This morning, the story is broken that Joe Biden didn't actually tell his cabinet he wasn't running. He assigned a White House staffer, or a White House staffer did it. At this point, all the country has seen is one tweet. There's been no presidential address. This was predictable, and in fact, it was predicted. 10 months ago, I publicly predicted what is happening right now. On my podcast, Verdict with Ted Cruz, in September of last year, I predicted that the Democrats would yank Joe Biden off the ballot, and at the time I predicted that they would replace him with Michelle Obama. Now, I would note when I said that, many in the corporate media responded with laughter and ridicule. They said effectively I was a moonbat, tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorist. There was no universe in which Joe Biden would be removed from office. That was 10 months ago. I predicted it again a month ago, on the night of the presidential debate. That night, immediately after the debate concluded, I recorded a podcast analyzing what had happened at the debate. And I said then, this will go down as the most consequential presidential debate in history. Why? Because it will result in Joe Biden dropping out of the office, and there has never been a debate in the history of our country that has changed the names on the ballot, that has removed the name of somebody who otherwise was going to be on the ballot. The night of the debate, I said, it is inevitable. Joe Biden will withdraw. The party will force him off. And I said it'll take about 3 weeks for that to happen. Well, yesterday that came to fruition. Today, it appears the Democrats are going to nominate a candidate who has been voted for by nobody, whom no Democrat has voted in a primary for she or he to be their president. That was their plan. Although I would note, had the debate not occurred, I don't know if this would be happening right now. None of the Democrats seem concerned that Joe Biden lacks the mental capacity to be commander-in-chief. None of the Democrats seem concerned that he lacks the mental capacity to even know what's going on around him. None of the Democrats seem to be concerned that he quite literally has his finger on the button and the ability to fire nuclear ICBMs and eliminate mankind from the face of the planet. I dearly hope he doesn't think that button is for ordering pizza. The White House said a few weeks ago he's very alert and on his game between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. And so let us hope China and Russia and North Korea and Venezuela and Cuba and all of our enemies confine their hostilities to the hours between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. For the Democrats, his lack of ability to perform the job of commander-in-chief, that was not disqualifying. They would happily have stayed with him, except the debate happened. And the debate happened. Anyone who watched the debate, it was obvious that Joe Biden lacked the mental capabilities to keep going on. You could no longer deny it to the American people. Anyone who's ever had an elderly relative going through the challenges of dementia or Alzheimer's, if you have a relative and you've seen it, you know exactly what it is. And every person watching that debate knew exactly what is going on. Now listen, all of us are on the path of old age. But some people get there more rapidly than others. So where are we now? Less than 24 hours after the announcement, it appears the Democrats are circling around Kamala Harris. At this point, I believe it is extremely likely Kamala Harris will be the Democrat nominee. My initial prediction of Michelle Obama, it appears, one must infer, she's decided she doesn't want it, which I noted at the time was the one thing that could save us from a Michelle Obama presidency, is if she decided she didn't want it. We now have Kamala as the sitting vice president. She's been endorsed by Joe Biden, at least via tweet. He has not spoken to the American people. She's been endorsed by Bill and Hillary Clinton. She's been frantically endorsed by potential opponents, people like Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, people like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, as we begin to see the auditioning go on for who's going to be her VP nominee as they desperately circle around. Understand this was the plan. The Democrat Party is cynical, but they're also savvy. There is a reason they did this right after the Republican convention. I was in Milwaukee for the Republican convention. I've never seen as strong a convention in my life. I've never seen the Republican Party as unified as we are right now, unified behind re-electing Donald Trump, winning a Republican majority in the Senate, winning a Republican majority in the House. And the Democrats timed this announcement to try to counteract any bounce that comes out of the convention and to hope that the media spends the next month singing the hosannas of Kamala Harris and whatever very boring white guy she picks as her VP. And sadly, the Democrats are such bean card counting parties that is exactly what she's looking for, is give me Wonder Bread. That will be the VP nominee. She's counting on billions of dollars of free media from the press recreating her. Well, today we're here to make clear 100% of the Joe Biden record is Kamala Harris's. Kamala Harris was named the quote-unquote border czar of the last 4 years. As the border czar, that's Joe Biden's term, not mine, she bears direct responsibility for the chaos at our southern border. Now, mind you, as border czar, it must be nice to have a job that requires you to work fewer hours than Joe Biden. Joe Biden only works 10 to 4, if he's awake then. Kamala Harris, in 4 years as border czar, has been to our southern border precisely once. And the one time she went to El Paso, where they cleaned it up so she saw no illegal immigrants. And the entire time, the Rio Grande Valley in Texas has been the epicenter of the invasion we've been seeing in this country. She's been to the Rio Grande Valley as vice president a total of 0 times. Eagle Pass has seen a massive invasion. She's been to Eagle Pass as vice president a total of 0 times. Del Rio. I was down in Del Rio. Del Rio is a town of about 30,000 people on the Texas-Mexico border. I was down there when in a single day, more than 10,000 Haitian illegal immigrants were crossing in one day. Over a third of the population of the city invading in a single day. You know who wasn't there? Kamala Harris, the border czar. Because border czar means she ignores the issue, she doesn't understand the issue, and ultimately, she's complicit in facilitating the invasion. And I want to tell you who also bears full responsibility for the disastrous policies of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, and his name is Colin Allred. Colin Allred is running against me for the United States Senate. Colin Allred is an extremely liberal Democrat incumbent congressman from Dallas. Colin Allred, his first 4 years in Congress, voted 100% with Nancy Pelosi. There was quite literally not a single vote he disagreed with her on. It would have been identical, by the way, had Colin Allred showed up the day he was elected, pulled out his voting card, slapped it on the table on Nancy's desk and said, "Nancy, here's my voting card, you take care of this. Whatever San Francisco wants, that's what Texas wants too." The results would have been identical had he done that. When it comes to the border, Colin Allred has over and over and over again voted in favor of open borders. Now recently, he's decided he needs some PR. So number one, he counts on the corporate media to describe him using the following word cloud: moderate, bipartisan centrist who unifies people, just like Nancy Pelosi does. Mind you, he voted identically to her. So unless, as a reporter, you're prepared to make the case to the American people that Nancy Pelosi is a moderate, bipartisan centrist, unless you can make that case on the merits, and spoiler alert, you can't, you cannot use those words to describe him because his record is of a radical left-wing Democrat. When it comes to the border, he's voted against H.R. 2, strong legislation that would actually secure the border. He voted no. Now, he's recently begun beating his chest saying, well, I did vote for a resolution saying we have a crisis on the southern border. Truly a profile in courage. 11.5 million people have invaded our country. Texas is seeing the misery, the death, the suffering of the invasion at our southern border. And so he stands out and says, we have a crisis. And then he turns around and votes no on any tangible, meaningful step to solve the crisis. If you want to understand just how radical Colin Allred's record is on the border, understand that Colin Allred has voted against deporting illegal immigrants who violently assault police officers. Now, I'm going to suggest to you, if you gather 100 Houstonians and just ask them, hey, if there's an illegal immigrant who punches a cop, should you deport them? And almost any Houstonian, almost any Texan would say, of course, that's common sense. Well, not Colin Allred. He voted no. Even if an illegal immigrant assaults a police officer, do not deport him. Now, it's interesting. Colin Allred recently came out with a TV commercial. A TV commercial where there are 254 counties in Texas. He found 2 elected Democrats in uniforms to say, Allred is tough on the border. That was the word, tough. Very tough. Except for the fact that he consistently votes against any provision to actually secure the border, to actually deport an illegal alien, to actually enforce the law, to actually protect our communities. Other than that, if you want to know what Colin Allred thinks on the border, listen to his own words, where he stood up and said the border wall is racist. That's his term. And he personally would tear the border wall down. Now listen, he's entitled to have those views. Those views are not unusual. That's the same view AOC has. That's the same view Rashida Tlaib has. That's the same view Ilhan Omar has. That's the view of the radical left squad in Congress. It happens also to be the view of Colin Allred. What he's not entitled to do is run away from his record. Now, as the days and weeks and months unfolded up until yesterday when Joe Biden dropped out, do you know what Allred consistently refused to do? Answer the question if Joe Biden should drop out. You had Democrat senators standing up saying Biden needs to drop out. You had scores of Democrat House members saying Biden needs to drop out. You had the media saying Biden needs to drop out. You had George Clooney saying Biden needs to drop out. And yet Colin Allred, when asked, would turn and run because he was unwilling to answer that question. The internet has dubbed a nickname for him of Can't Comment Colin. And I'll just point out, look, all of you are professional reporters. I'm curious how many of you have had an interview with Colin Allred. How many of you has he been willing? All right, we got one. That is good. But for the entire campaign, he's been unwilling to answer questions, even basic questions. He's running a basement strategy where he hides. But now with Kamala Harris, we have a moment of clarity. Now we sit here. Lots and lots of Democrats have endorsed Kamala Harris. You know who hasn't? Colin Allred. You know who may well not? Colin Allred. Why? Because he's unlikely to answer a reporter's question. He did, however, send out a fundraising email where he says, give money to me and we need to support Kamala. So maybe that's an endorsement. I don't want to overstate. He's at least willing to take money from people who support Kamala. And that is one thing that the Allred campaign is good at, is raising money from radical left Democrats all over the country. They're printing money. From radical left Democrats who despise Texas and who want to turn Texas into California. If you want Texas to become California, if you want your next senator to be a Nancy Pelosi clone, you've got an easy choice here. But the consequence of today is very important. The Democrat Party is circling the wagons around Joe Biden's border czar as the next nominee. If Kamala Harris is the nominee, Understand what that means. That means every elected Democrat in the House and Senate, their agenda is continuing the Biden-Harris open borders. The border czar will keep this same invasion going. That's Colin Allred's agenda. Not saying he's tough. By the way, you know what Colin Allred also hadn't said anything about? Jocelyn Nungary, the beautiful 12-year-old little girl here in Houston, kidnapped, violently assaulted, and murdered by 2 illegal immigrants that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris released. He hasn't said anything about Rachel Marin, the beautiful mother of 5, raped and murdered in suburban Maryland by an illegal immigrant Joe Biden and Kamala Harris released. He hasn't said anything about Laken Riley, the beautiful 22-year-old nursing student in Georgia, murdered by an illegal immigrant that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris released. He hasn't said anything about the 15-year-old girl who, thankfully, we don't know her name, she's a minor, in Boston, Massachusetts, who was raped by an illegal immigrant from Haiti that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they didn't just release him, they actually flew him from Haiti to Boston. He was released in Boston and he promptly raped a 15-year-old girl with severe mental disabilities. He was arrested, and in recent days, a liberal judge released him on a $500 bond. These are the policies that Colin Allred supports. These policies are terrible for Texas. They're terrible for the country. What happened yesterday was a deliberate subversion of democracy by the Democrat Party. But it also provides absolute clarity that Colin Allred and every other Democrat on the ballot is campaigning to make Joe Biden's border czar the President of the United States, which means the open borders and the disastrous policies of the Biden-Harris administration would continue and would get worse, and that is very, very bad for Texas. With that, I want to recognize Representative Charles Cunningham.
Thank you, Senator Cruz. My name is Charles Cunningham. I am the state representative for District 127 in Northeast Harris County. That encompasses Kingwood, Huffman, Humboldt, and the Spring area. I want to start out by saying to the media, thank you. You know, there's a saying that says, keep living. And soon your steps will get slow, your teeth will fall out, your hair, if it doesn't turn gray, it'll fall out. And I want to say that to the media because you have shown the public what we as Republicans already knew. The president doesn't jog no more up to the podium. The president doesn't ride a bike anymore. And the president doesn't take those steps as fast anymore. But the reality came after the debate. And then his own party said, we've got to act. And so I just want to say thank you, because the president should be the president of all people. Doesn't matter, color, party, of all people. And now I want to switch gears because Senator Cruz has spoke on it. I want to talk about how this affects Texas. Last year, I went down to the border, Eagle Pass, rode there with the National Guard, rode on the boats up and down the river. Thousands of people crossing. I could just reach out on the boat and just high-five them. Thousands of them. That effect on Texas alone put the pressure on our infrastructure, on our hospital systems, on our schools. We couldn't even treat our own people here in Harris County. You know, Harris County, Houston, Texas is about 2 million people. It took over 100 years to get to 2 million. It took 1 year to have 2 million people cross over in the border. and I know y'all fact check me just to make sure, but that is in 1 year. 2 million people crossed over into our border. And they were coming from all over. Russia, China, the Middle East, Africa, and of course South America. But what really got me was, they were on first-class flights to Mexico and then getting out and coming over to the border. Thank you again, media. I saw several people look like they were still in the airport with their luggage just rolling across to get to our border. Saw several people calling Ubers to take their destination to get to our border. That is all because of the policies that we have today with this current administration. It's the policy of the so-called drug czar, as the senator has so spoken, never went down to the hot spot, but went over to El Paso, where it was all looking nice and clean. And so those policies are going to continue. We already know this. And that's going to put an effect on us here in Texas. The energy policies are going to affect us. That's going to put an effect here on Texas. Now, when Governor Abbott started flying, however you want to call it, sending people all over the country, because before then it was just a Texas problem. But once he started doing that, what did New York say? What did Chicago say? I'll tell you what they said. They said, help. So now as we look forward to a great victory in November, I want my fellow Texans to know, Texas needs a true leader. Texas needs someone that's going to look out not only for Texas, but for the country. Senator's already spoken. We have our issues over in Israel. I am an ardent supporter of Israel. We have our issues all over the world. That's the senator's, that's his lane. But we need to make sure that America will continue to be the bright shining star that we have. And so with that, I'm going to step aside, and if you don't, give it to Cindy Siegel.
Cindy Siegel, the Harris County Republican Party Chairman.
Good morning. Well, they say all politics are local. And like you all, I've been watching over the past almost 4 years what's been going on from Washington, D.C. on down. And we've been told that we're supposed to buy into the fact that Joe Biden had all of his facilities, was the one that was at the helm, who was actually running the country. Just a few weeks ago, after the debate, we were told by the media, well, ignore the photos, ignore the videos. Those were just, those were changed. But we saw very clearly the difference between an elderly man who's incapacitated mentally and an older man who has his facilities. We're not talking age here. There are people that are in their 80s and 90s that are very sharp. We're talking about someone who had the mental capacity to be the most powerful man in the world. And who's driving the bus? You have to ask yourself that question. We've watched his failed policies and how they impact us here locally. We've been told by the Democrat Party that, yeah, you're safer. When in reality, we saw that at the beginning of the year in Houston, we were all of a sudden told that all those crime statistics, that they weren't closing out the cases, that they were just removing them from the books. We were told that Joe Biden was running the ship, that he was there and engaged, when in reality, what we all saw firsthand was that he didn't have the mental capacity to be the president, and he doesn't today. I've known people, 3 of my precinct chairs in the last year have lost children, adult children, to fentanyl. I just recently, last week, came back, I had the opportunity to be at the National Convention. And the heartbreak stories of the failed policies of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, the exit from Afghanistan, the Gold Star families that Joe Biden won't even mention those soldiers' names. And yet at the debate, Joe Biden said he's never lost any soldiers. So we have the everyday men and women who are moving to the Republican Party because they know that they haven't been told the truth, that they've been lied to. They've been lied to, and the policies of the Democrat Party have failed them. So when you go to the poll, to the independent voters, I'm speaking to you. Do you feel safer? Is your family safer? Are you concerned about what's crossing the border? Are you concerned about your children? As a mother of 2 daughters, it broke my heart to hear about little Jocelyn. That's the worst nightmare, to lose your child in any way, but to lose them to illegal immigrants who raped and murdered her. I can't even imagine the heartbreak. Do you feel safer? I don't. Do you feel more secure? Is your family secure? I don't think my family's more secure. Do your dollars go further? I don't think our dollars go further. I have a daughter in New York. I see that she's paying almost 50% of her income in taxes and cost of living. It's hard for these kids coming out of school to live and have a decent salary. And they worry about their future. And that's the future that I worry about for not only my daughters, but all of Harris County citizens and possibly future grandchildren. So when you go to vote, I will tell you, do your research. Don't listen to the lies that are being perpetuated by the Democrat Party. The fact is, they lied to you about Joe Biden. They lied to you about Kamala Harris being the border czar. They've lied to you about, well, fentanyl isn't that big of a deal. They've lied to you about inflation and the economy. We're here in Harris County Republican Party. We've got great candidates who are running. Senator Cruz, from the top of the ticket to President Trump, J.D. Vance, the senator, and other candidates down to the local candidates. Do your research, and I think once you do your research, I think you'll be voting Republican in November.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Charles. With that, we'll open up to questions.
Senator Cruz, do you plan to investigate President Biden's health over his term, i.e. is the debate just the tip of the iceberg? And a follow-up on that, is Jill Biden, the 21st century Mrs. Woodrow Wilson?
Look, in terms of the first question about whether I plan to investigate it, sadly in the Senate, there will not be any Senate investigations because Chuck Schumer is the majority leader, the Democrats have the gavels, and this Democrat Party has zero interest in investigating any of these issues. In 3.5 years on the Senate Judiciary Committee, you know how many hearings we've had on the chaos at our open border, on 11.5 million illegal immigrants invading this country? Zero. Because when the Democrats are the chairman of the committees, they're not interested in this topic. Let's take just this week. I joined a number of other senators calling on the Senate Judiciary Committee to hold an emergency hearing with the director of the Secret Service and the Secretary of Homeland Security and the director of the FBI as to why there were catastrophic security failures that led to the assassination attempt on President Trump. That assassination attempt came within a half inch of murdering President Trump. The Secret Service had catastrophic failures. I had a briefing last week with the head of the Secret Service. She is stonewalling. She is refusing to answer any questions. There is no accountability whatsoever. She has said she will not resign. I got to say, what does it take to get fired in the Joe Biden administration? She should have been fired that day. By the way, after Afghanistan, after the disastrous debacle in Afghanistan, the failed withdrawal that resulted in 13 servicemen and women being murdered, not a single person was fired. And so will the Senate engage in that oversight? No. I believe the House will. And I believe the American people will. And there is an obvious question. Every Democrat is saying Joe Biden is no longer fit to be a candidate for president. Actually, they're not saying that. They're just saying he's not the candidate anymore. We won't tell you why. Well, the obvious question is, if he is not mentally competent to be a candidate for president, how is he still serving as president of the United States? Are we to hope over the next 5 months that the bad guys will just take a vacation? That there will be no challenges facing America that require a commander-in-chief? Because that's the position of every Democrat. So We should have an investigation and accountability. And as for Jill Biden, listen, I think the Woodrow Wilson analysis and analogy is quite apt. Woodrow Wilson, at the end of his presidency, was not competent, and his wife, for all intents and purposes, was making the decisions. Candidly, I'm going to give you a really scary answer. So I get asked this all the time, and for 4 years I've been asked this. People all over Texas, they'll ask me, they'll say, Ted, who's really running things? Who's making decisions in the White House? And here's the scariest answer. I don't know. I genuinely have no idea. My assumption is that it's Barack Obama. Barack Obama is the only president in modern times who stayed in Washington, D.C., bought a big home up in Kalorama, their cars there every night. I assume it's Obama pulling the strings through a bunch of apparatchik staffers. But the candid answer is I have no idea. And no other Republican senator does it either. We sit around and ask. I know the effect. I know the outcome. I just don't know the process that produces it. The outcome is on every single policy issue, this White House goes to the radical left. That the people driving the agenda are Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and AOC and the Colin Allreds of the world. It's the radical left. So on border policies, they support open borders. On law and order, they support defunding or abolishing the police. On gender issues, they support sterilization and radical surgeries of minors. Those are extreme positions. On Israel, they undermine Israel and they send $100 billion to Iran. Iran provides 90% of the funding to Hamas and Hezbollah, so they fund our enemies and undermine our allies. This coming week, Prime Minister Netanyahu will be in Washington speaking to a joint session of Congress. Many Democrat congressmen will boycott that speech because the Democrat Party is now fundamentally the most anti-Israel party we have seen in modern times. It will be very interesting to see whether Colin Allred shows up or not. He's going to be conflicted. His instinct is going to be to boycott the speech because, I would point out, if you look at the anti-Semitic protests across the country and college campuses, those are not organic, they are being funded. You notice the tents all match? Millions of dollars have funded those protests. Among the leading funders of those protests are George Soros, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and the Pritzker family. Those also happen to be among the leading donors to Joe Biden, and those three in particular have given $80,000 to Colin Allred. Among questions Allred does not answer is, will he give back the $80,000 from the funders for the anti-Israel, anti-Semitic protesters? He won't answer that because he doesn't answer questions. But in terms of who's running it, I don't know if it's Jill Biden or Barack Obama or somebody else. I just know the outcome is an agenda that is deeply harmful to Texas.
Senator, earlier in this campaign, you talked a lot about your bipartisan
Yeah.
experience. Today we're hearing a lot of a different message. You know, the Democratic Party is cynical, they're lying to the American people. Does the departure of Joe Biden from this race mean that your campaign is entering a different, more aggressive phase?
No, both are entirely possible. And I will say this is something that many in the media have a hard time understanding. So I've been in the Senate 12 years. The people of Texas have entrusted me with fighting for 30 million Texans for the past 12 years. In that entire time, I've had two principal responsibilities. Number one is to lead the fight against bad policies that hurt Texans. And that's a job I have relished, whether the bad policies came from Barack Obama or Chuck Schumer or Joe Biden. It's a job I think I'm pretty good at. Leading the fight against horrible policies that hurt Texans, whether it's open borders, whether it's undermining law enforcement, whether it's releasing criminals, whether it's undermining our allies abroad, whether it's supporting anti-American terrorists who hate us. Leading the fight against those policies is something I've been proud to do every day. At the same time, it is also my job to work to pass meaningful pro-jobs, pro-growth legislation that makes a difference for Texans. My top 3 priorities I can sum up in 3 words: jobs, freedom, security. My number 1 priority is jobs, and in my 12 years in the Senate, I have authored and passed 100 different pieces of legislation into law, earning bipartisan support, getting them enacted. I would note, again, the media loves to describe Colin Allred as a bipartisan centrist. In his entire time in Congress, he has passed 3 bills into law. I've authored and passed 100. And so in terms of record, it is entirely possible to do both at the same time. So, for example, one of the most recent bills that I just passed into law was the FAA reauthorization bill, landmark legislation, $110 billion for aviation in America, invested in aviation safety, invested billions of dollars in airports in Texas and across the country, directed the FAA to hire the maximum number of air traffic controllers, invested in technology to avoid or lessen the risk of collisions on runways, landing or taking off. It also enhanced competition. We had a major victory for Texas in that bill, which is San Antonio has never had a direct flight to Ronald Reagan DCA National Airport. San Antonio, the entire community of San Antonio desperately wants a direct flight to and from Reagan. 4 or 5 years ago, the city leadership came to me from San Antonio, the mayor, the city council, almost all Democrats, I would know. And they asked, and the business community and local community, they said, can you lead the fight to get this done? I said, absolutely. I made the case San Antonio is the 7th largest city in America. It's frequently called Military City USA. It has an enormous military population, both active duty military and veterans. Reagan Airport is right next to the Pentagon. It's right next to Arlington Memorial Cemetery. I made the case. I drafted the provision of the legislation creating the new slots. It was the single most contentious battle. The Democrats from Maryland and Virginia fought vigorously against it. And at the end of the day, Texas prevailed. The final vote on the floor of the Senate was 88-4, the 4 being the 2 Maryland and 2 Virginia senators. The bill was signed into law, and in a matter of weeks, San Antonio is going to get its direct flight. So it is possible to do both. I would point out likewise, again in recent weeks, another bill that I authored and passed into law is a bill expediting the building of 4 new bridges on our southern border across the Rio Grande River, 2 in Laredo, 1 in Eagle Pass, 1 in Brownsville. The Biden administration was putting bureaucratic roadblocks in place. I authored the legislation to streamline it, to speed up every one of those bills by several years, and the effect of that is going to be thousands of new jobs and billions of dollars of economic benefit for Texas farmers and ranchers and businesses and manufacturers. So you can do both. You can stand up and fight the radical policies from the left, and at the same time you can pass meaningful pro-jobs legislation. Yes?
In that spirit, if Kamala Harris becomes president, how will you work with her next year?
Well, look, I am happy to work with anyone, but I have every confidence if, God forbid, Kamala Harris becomes president, she will do as lousy a job as president as she has done as vice president. Simply ask yourself, she's been border czar. Good job, bad job. How would you rate the job Kamala Harris has done as border czar on a scale of 1 to 100? And if I were to rate it on a scale of 1 to 100, my answer would be negative 6,003. She has presided over the worst invasion of the United States of America in the history of our country. 11.5 million people, and it's deliberate. She wanted this to happen. Joe Biden wanted this to happen. And the reason, listen, I spoke to the Republican convention last week, and I said, this has happened cynically because Democrats wanted votes more than they cared about protecting our children. And I have to say, some in the media have clutched their pearls. How could you say such a thing? It is the only conclusion that is possible. Because if that's not right, lots of folks in the media have said, no. No Democrat wants the vote from these 11.5 million people. Okay, then why have they done this? Why have they opened up the border and allowed this invasion? And by the way, I would encourage you, if you spend any time in South Texas, I spend a lot of time in South Texas. I spend a lot of time in the Rio Grande Valley. South Texas is turning red rapidly. Why? because you can't see this and defend this. South Texas has always been Democrat. But you can't see the dead bodies. Every day people are dying because of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's open borders. You can't see the little girls and little boys being abused. I've looked in the eyes of children, one after the other, who have been assaulted repeatedly by human traffickers. You can't look in the eyes of women who've been repeatedly raped by human traffickers. You can't look in the eyes of grieving parents who've lost children to fentanyl overdoses. You can't defend it anymore. Kamala Harris has been in charge of it, and she deliberately produced this crisis. So sadly, if she is president, the only reasonable expectation is that this gets worse. That's why we've got to stand together to make sure she's not elected president. Yeah.
One more, last one. Senator, when I'm reporting the state's abortion ban is for their lives in danger and threaten their future fertility because they can't get the procedure in dangerous instances, what can you do as a senator to address that?
You know, the Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision said that abortion is an issue. It is an issue that divides America. It is an issue that Americans have passionate beliefs, good faith, personal, emotional views, and strong disagreements. And what the Supreme Court said is under our Constitution, the way we resolve issues like that is through the democratic process. It is through the process of electing representatives in the state legislature and deciding on the laws. It is not by having 9 unelected judges in Washington, D.C. decree the rule for 330 million Americans across this country. And so the Supreme Court in Dobbs returned the issue to the democratic process. It was a victory for democracy. Now, what's the state of the law now? The state of the law now is that each state decides what are the rules that will govern abortion. In blue states, in states like California and New York, there are essentially no limits. In redder states, there are more meaningful restrictions. And the particular restrictions that are enacted, they vary state by state. Every state has a different answer to that. And those limitations reflect the values of the citizens of those states. I think that's the way our Constitution is meant to operate. I think that is democracy in action. And so the state legislature in Texas is going to determine what the rules are. I don't serve in the state legislature in Texas. And it's going to be the voters in Texas that are going to decide what the rules are. I believe we should protect human life. I think human life is precious. But I also believe that you should have to persuade your fellow citizens in order to enact rules. So in terms of, you asked about my role in the Senate, I'll say a couple of things. Number one, Colin Allred's views on abortion are truly radical, and they reflect the views of many of the congressional Democrats. Colin Allred supports unlimited abortion on demand up until the moment of birth. In the 8th month of pregnancy, in the 9th month of pregnancy, literally the day of labor, he supports abortion being permissible, with zero restrictions, no parental notification, no parental consent, and full taxpayer funding. Now, objectively speaking, that view, Colin Allred's view, is a radical view. Nationally, 9% of Americans agree with that. 91% of Americans disagree with that proposition. Even a majority of Americans who call themselves pro-choice say, okay, up until the moment of birth, that is too far. And by the way, when I say Colin Allred supports that, it is because he has voted for legislation that would strike down every single reasonable restriction on abortion in the country. That's what he has voted for. So you want to know the difference on abortion from him and me serving in the Senate. The difference is he would vote for legislation striking down every restriction in America and allowing abortion up until the moment of birth. I agree with the Supreme Court that it should be decided by the elected legislatures in each state, and that's the way it operates in Texas. All right, thank you, guys.